I've never actually used this function of Discord, so bear with me. Hey, Socks, it's been a while. All right, so I'm thinking we'll wait a couple more minutes before jumping in. I have no idea what the attrition rate versus, or like attendance versus interest is going to be, so just got to pull the trigger at some point. All right, if you guys could give me like what you're going to ask when you make a request to speak, just sort of put my mind at ease. Sure, we can do a little quick test, I guess. Make sure we have it working. If someone wants to make one. It will be at the end, so I guess that would be a good thing to kill the time with. To start, I'm going to read through a presentation that I wrote about ChatGPT and associated language models. And then there will be a discussion and question answering and a more sort of collaborative discussion. So, HK, you're on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so that seems to be working. So is this like a permanent thing? I don't know. It's all good, man. All right. We're all learning together. That is the name of the server, after all. All right. It seems that things are sort of leveling out here around like 40-ish, so we're going to get started. Yeah. All right. So, thank you all for joining us here today for the inaugural Learn AI Together reading group. Today's topic will be ChatGPT and sort of the history and future of text generation and NLP as a whole. And hopefully you guys will enjoy it, and we'll get people who want to come back to listen and people who want to come back to do their own presentations. So my name is Tyler, and here are the authors for posterity. I need to start OBS. That's important. I almost screwed it up. All right. So, my name's Tyler Collodi. I sometimes go by Nex online. I'm a computer science major at McGill. I have a BA in psychology and a master's in information studies. I pursue careers in neither of those fields. life is long and a winding road. I started coding about 7.5 years ago and got into AI, specifically NLP, 6 years ago. Most of my time in AI has been spent looking at NLP and its applications. But over the past few years, I've pivoted to graph generation and molecular slash materials discovery, as that's just something sort of taken my fancy. But I'm still very interested and sort of eager to learn and use uh, NLP models, and I'm particularly curious about how they can impact scientific research and political discourse. A quick disclaimer for everyone. This is the very first reading group. It's something that Lewis, Alex, and I have put together over the last few weeks, but it's not in any sort of final form. We're not super sure what everyone's interests or skill levels or expectations are. So I took a poll and got some feedback on what people wanted to see. That's why this is a discussion of the history, not just ChatGPT itself. But don't take this as like the way things are supposed to be. It's something that will change and evolve with the needs and wants of the community, and future presenters and the community in general will help sort of dictate what they want to do and the form this will take. Also, it's been pointed out to me that I went real hard on this one. That is what happens when I'm interested in stuff. But you don't have to have, X amount of experience or um, put in, X amount of work in order to be a presenter. You can do it just because you're interested and enthusiastic and want to share that with people. So don't hold this as any sort of standard to be achieved or reached. So a quick overview of the presentation. This we're first bleh, great. We're first going to go over the origins of NLP and some of the earlier methods like rule-based and stochastic methods. We'll look briefly at some of the early neural networks that were used in NLP, and then move on to more, quote, modern methods such as word2vec, getting into transformers and pre-training. We'll then get into greater detail about GPT, ChatGPT, and the DeepMind model Sparrow. We'll look at what they can do, what they can't do, make some short-term predictions, and then we'll move on to the discussion portion where everyone is able to sort of say their piece. So, as with most things in computer science, AI, and natural language processing, it started with Alan Turing. Most things in our field did, and particularly the Turing test, which is so ubiquitous. I knew about this long before I got into AI. But for those who aren't aware of a more formal definition, it's essentially a constructed party game with 3 participants. Player C basically attempts to discover through inquiry the identity of player A and player B, with one of them being a machine and one of them being a person. The idea of like the Turing's thought process was basically if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's AGI. So these days it's a little more rigorous. It's not really the test that we rely on to detect AGI, but it is still an important thing to mention given the topic. Also, I just wanted to include this little snippet about some of the early expectations of AI to show that overhype nonsense is not new to this century. So here you see a business magnate making some predictions that didn't quite come true about the state of AI and machine learning, which wasn't really even a thing at this point, but the concept of thinking machines and where they might be in 10 to 20 years. And he was very incorrect. So AI started where coding did, with everything being very rule-based and deterministic. Uh, Eliza was the first, quote, chatbot that the world ever saw, but it was really just a very complicated series of instructions, scripts, and rules that, when framed in a certain way, particularly as a psychoanalyst who mostly just parroted back what the speaker said to them, it could somewhat approximate a conversation. However, despite this being a sort of test by its creator to show that this is actually a lot harder than some people think, people did still ascribe intelligence that wasn't there to this method. But the wider field sort of gave up on this all at once approach, and a lot of the subsequent advances were made more iteratively and focusing on smaller, discrete steps. One example of that is Noam Chomsky's context-free grammars, which is a way to mathematically essentially describe the methods of how a language generates units of itself in a natural way. This is the sort of thing that's now sort of pervasive in programming languages as well as markdown languages like XML, and it sort of shows that even in the simplest cases, there's a lot of good and use that could be gotten from applying or merging computer science and linguistics. One of the most common and old methods that we still use is regular expressions. These were developed back in the 50s, and they take as input a string that will that through a series of rules will be interpreted to allow you to make string selections of within a document that are very precise. You can have it, take into account some number of repeats or no repeats. You can have it be any character or a subset of characters. It allows you to do things like this one right here would allow you to find the occurrences of the word ruin, ran, and run, which is just an idea, just an example I thought would be pretty simple. But you can see that even with this pretty simple example, the actual thing is a little inscrutable. So hopefully we get a little explanation of exactly what it does down here. Rule-based methods have certainly made progress and they have their uses, but it wasn't too long before researchers realized that maybe hard and fast rules in something called natural language wasn't going to cut it, and they started looking at more statistical analysis of languages. This is things like frequency diagrams of letters or words or phrases in a document. And one of the first big triumphs was statistical machine translation, which is exactly what it sounds. It sort of just uses pretty rigorous statistical models to make the best approximation when translating between two languages. Into the 90s, we start seeing the first hints of, quote, big data, and the Penn Tree Bank data set was created. The irony being, of course, that a data set of a million or so words isn't anything close to big these days, but this is where we started, and here's where we are. One of the most notable sort of advances in how words and language could be represented was in term frequency, or TF-IDF, which is term frequency over document frequency. And essentially, if you have words that are just littered throughout your text, like is, the, and, just the typical glue words of English, at least, they're going to be very low because they're everywhere. But words like achievements or accuracy, in this particular case, those are only going to be mentioned once or twice, and they're going to probably be clustered in a few documents, and that sort of gives an indication that these are important, thus increasing their weighting of the algorithm. So this is just a little script or little output of a script that does TF-IDF run on this presentation or an earlier version of it, and you can see that a lot of these are glue words or very common to the subject we're discussing, and then the more specific ones, you can see sort of the weakness here. It's not a very big corpus, so you get a lot of these things that are maxed out and aren't actually that meaningful. So with sort of the limitations of stochastic NLP, we start to see the emergence of neural networks being brought in, most notably the recurrent neural network, which handles time series data by not just taking in the next token, which is usually a word, um, but also taking in the previous token or um, an input related to it as part of that input. And that is where the recurrence comes from, because there's always a little bit of the previous, the rest of the input in your, or the output, I should say, in the next input. And that's weighted by distance. So, the words from 600 words ago aren't going to be nearly as important as the ones you just read. But this leads to issues of forgetting, because there are important callbacks and relations in language that go far beyond what this can really preserve in the way that it's done. So augmentations were made, such as long short-term memories, LSTMs, which use these memory gates to sort of hold on to particularly relevant pieces of uh, information and preserve them more effectively than the base RNN. And that gave some pretty good results up until, I would say, probably the start of the 2010s. Now, with the dawn of the 2010s, which I'm saying like it's ancient history, but was 12 years ago, we get Word2Vec, and this is where we start really seeing the foundations being laid for modern architectures and modern large language models. Word2Vec was devised in 2013 and uses a single layer neural network, so not technically a deep neural net, to predict a masked word based on the context around it. So it would have a moving window over a sentence, and each time it would mask the center word and take as input all the words within, let's say, 5 tokens of it. During this process, using normal neural network things like backpropagation, allows the model to start creating weights associated with each word or phrase. And as these are updated, these weights start to take on characteristics that are approximating or starting to approach sort of ways we would think of words. It's still very shoddy, but it's there. So the most famous example of this is if you take the vector for the word king and subtract the word man, add the word woman. And when I say word, I mean the vector for the words. This is all just straight vector operations. The resulting vector will be something similar to queen. And as you can see in this very poorly drawn, but nonetheless pervasive image here, the individual numbers that make up these vectors have some rough correlation to concepts that we would understand. This is not, a literal example, but you do sort of get this thing where you can group things by age, or group them by how feminine they are, or group them by sort of association using cosine similarity of the different vectors. So you see here that, king, queen, and princess are all high in royalty, but woman is not. But then when you get to masculinity, only king is particularly high, and then you get to femininity, and it's the inverse, where everything except king is high. And that allows for not just a weighting of the words, but some idea of how they relate to each other. And that's sort of where we start with this paradigm of both pre-training and unsupervised training, because you don't need to have labeled data to do this. You can just have it ingest words, and it will, for lack of a better phrase, just work. I'm gonna stop right now just to quickly see. Oh yeah, there's a few of us from Montreal. Are people able to see my screen, see the presentation? Can I just get confirmation, because I can never actually see it myself? Okay, good. All right. Any questions right now? I don't want this to just be me monologuing at a screen without knowing if people are following along or if they have questions. All right, I'll check back in a sec to see what people are saying. But is it still being used today? Kind of. I mean, I myself have used it even just a few years ago. It really is a very easy to understand algorithm. Don't worry if you don't get it from my, 2 slides, but when if you did a bit of reading yourself and look at it, it's pretty transparent compared to some of the stuff that's coming out now. Um, but no, for the most part, things like BERT and later models do what Word2Vec does, but to a greater extent and with more additional features. I know, but unfortunately, I can't grab everything. All right, I'm going to thank you. Hats off to you. But I'm gonna keep going. Please do feel free to continuously put things in chat, and I will read them as I'm able to. Uh, and yeah, well, we're gonna get it into the current AI summer. So Transformers, more than meets the eye, because I'm from the '90s. They're pretty aptly named. It's not really why they're called this, but they really kicked off this sort of lineage of large language models. Uh, but before we get to GPT, there are a few others that we should review. So first of all, what is a transformer? As I mentioned earlier, prior works mostly used recurrence, so basically just propagating some part of the previous output into the next input. And that has issues a lot, not unlike, although not mathematically analogous necessarily, to a broken telephone or the can and shoestring. Transformers don't use recurrence; they use attention, which is a method of essentially getting it all at once in a way that's not too dissimilar to what Word2Vec does in order to train itself. So it uses an encoder and a decoder to map the inputs to a continuous representation, like Word2Vec, and then decodes it in order to essentially decodes it with particular attention paid to the most useful parts of it, essentially. So it allows for long range dependencies, still limited by context window. So there is like this idea that I brought up with Word2Vec, where it's like you have this that you're trying to predict a word based on the context, and with transformers, the longer the context window, the longer the more sort of short-term memory it has, the more it can sort of keep in quote mind and respond, or the longer it can generate. Uh, but how does this do this exactly? Here's an explain like I'm five. It is a way for the model to focus on the most important words, like TF-IDF, by assigning a weight to each of them based on its relevance to the sentence. Although it may not necessarily literally be a sentence, it might be a document or some other, like a paragraph, some other discretization. The more important a word is, the higher its weight, and the model then uses the weights to determine what to focus on. Uh, Getting into why these work so incredibly well is a little beyond what we're doing here, but there will be citations at the end, and this will be free for people to the presentation. People will be free to look through it and do with it what they will. So there's always resources around to learn more about this. Once Transformers came out, there's this sort of short pause, and then a bunch of papers came out using Transformers and sort of figuring out what they could and couldn't do. And a lot of the most notable ones, there are others I'm sure that I'm forgetting, like XLNet and things like that, but a lot of them had Sesame Street names because I guess they were bored. But the key takeaway from what these taught us was that this pre-training dynamic that was first devised for Word2Vec, where you take unlabeled data and you just throw it into the model and have it try to predict the next word, that's a great start. So great a start, in fact, that you can then take that model and with pretty minimal tweaks to the weights, and even with just very small data sets, you can fine tune it to get very, very good results on downstream tasks, which can include text classification for things like bias or political leaning. It can be things like machine translation or, of course, text generation. The first of these, and really more of a peer of GPT than something GPT is built off of, is BERT, which instead of using a single context, which would be all the words you've read so far. It uses bidirectional context, which is actually more similar to Word2Vec. And that proved to be very, very effective. The later paper, Roberta, demonstrated that, yeah, BERT was really effective, but if they just left that thing cooking for like another bunch of time, it was actually very undertrained. These models have a lot of capacity to take in a huge amount of data for the number of parameters they have. Yes, they do get very big, but the amount of data they're ingesting is orders of magnitude larger. And then there is Elmo, which emphasized ways that the model and training data could scale, and how, to borrow a phrase, unreasonably effective it was to just straight up scale everything. Unlike previous methods where you would get asymptotically better results for a given benchmark, whatever you're training it, large language models, because they're generalists first, and then you sort of fine tune them to be more specific for your task, they have a lot of capacity to just keep improving and improving and improving. So that finally brings us to the GPT lineage, generative pre-trained transformer. It's basically everything that we just covered, but bigger. But the first GPT paper, at least, did have some interesting tweaks to the architecture. It used, the unsupervised generative task of word prediction, but for the discriminative fine-tuning, it actually found that by tweaking the inputs of that fine-tuning to be as suitable for that task as possible, they could get significantly better results. This isn't actually something that is particularly talked about these days, and in some ways GPT has eaten itself in that it's gotten so advanced that's less needed. But I think it's important to bring to light that GPT wasn't just BERT, but a different name. There were some legitimate improvements to it, and some clever engineering to get it to scale as much as it's about to. So GPT-2 is just a straight scaling of GPT. It's, there are engineering tweaks to make sure it can actually run and function at that scale, but whereas GPT was a few hundred million, GPT is 1.5 billion. It, again, outperformed the state of the art at the time, and in particular, we're seeing how a generalist agent with a huge pre-training data set can really leverage that to do very well on smaller data sets that have, or smaller tasks that have smaller data sets, such as our old friend, the Penn Tree Bank. And GPT-3 is, once again, just more. So I'm actually personally not a fan of this, well, let's just scale it approach, because it obviously puts things out of reach of anyone who's not at a huge university, or frankly, more likely, a huge company. But it does work. So it does have a larger context window, up to 2,480 tokens, which is, a short paper. That's still a limit, and that's still sort of a limiting factor even for ChatGPT, as we'll see eventually, but it's significantly larger than anything that had come before. That gives it better, quote, long-term memory and allows for longer outputs. In addition to the actual models, the data they're trained on is also expanding. So GPT-1 could be run theoretically by a very high-end modern machine. 40 gigs of web text, it might take frickin' ages, but you could batch that and run that through and get a model out of it. GPT-2, it's the same 40 gigs plus 8 million books, which approximate to about, depending on the books, 10 to 20 more gigs. GPT-3 went just all in and trained on the Common Crawl corpus, which is 1 trillion words, which is fun, all of Wikipedia, and web text, including Reddit, which I'm sure we're all very happy to hear about. I am just going to check back in to see how everyone's doing. Uh-huh. I didn't actually know that about Spanish, and I do have a very English-centric view of these models. So I do apologize for that, but it's good to know that that feature of the language kept sort of Word2Vec in the running longer. So when will scaling start to plateau? Really, we really don't know. Like it really is. I've read the GPT-3 paper, as I'm sure some of you have as well. And the impression I get from it is basically like, I don't know, man. I just keep putting more parameters, and it just keeps working. So we don't know. It's a little bit like predicting how high a mountain is when you're still on it. With GPT-4, I think if it wasn't going to continue with GPT-4, they would have known that already, and they would have tried something else, or maybe they have tried something else. So, but we do know GPT-4 is coming, so we'll actually discuss that in a little bit later. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water, see if there's any more questions, and we'll get on to the next slide, which is going to be actually talking about the thing we all came here for. All right, so Chat GPT is not, as you guys seem to be aware, Chat GPT, or it's not GPT-4, it's 3.5. And the reason they call it that is because it's based on the same model. It's based on 3, but they did do some additional things. It's almost ironic. There's more of a difference in the architecture between GPT-3 and GPT 3.5 than there is between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. But basically, the main change is that rather than just sort of the basic training scheme of feed it a bunch of data and then have it learn on downstream tasks, they really drilled down into the chat aspect, of course. So they had human annotators judge basically, well, first they had human annotators simulate, ironically, a conversation between a chatbot and a person, but both sides were played by a person. They used that to create a data set that they then fine-tuned GPT-3 on, and then they had the chatbot give responses to various prompts and have an annotator rank them. So for each prompt, they would have it give a good number of responses, and a human annotator would say how good is each response, which is the best, which is the worst. And this was used to train a separate reinforcement learning algorithm, which created a policy of sort of what is a good response. Finally, with that policy sort of established, they had the model, for lack of a better phrase, play with itself and use this policy in order to refine the model's behavior based off of that human annotated data. So it's a way to systematically and progressively have fewer and fewer humans involved, or less and less human involvement, which obviously hugely speeds up training time. So for a bit of a better sort of visualization of this is from the actual blog post, and you can see that they start basically with just generating a data set from people and having this pre-trained model train on that. Then we get to one human and one chatbot, but the human is still being kind of judgy. But they do that so that they can get this separate reinforcement learning model. The reward model is what they call it. This then is used in order to sort of restrain the model and coach the model as a proxy for a person who can't, they can't judge 50 million responses, but the model can. And that reward function is used to further refine what makes a good chatbot, basically. So they're really drilling down on the conversational agent aspect of it for ChatGPT, obviously. But as we've seen, you get a lot of other stuff for free when you do that, because conversational agents in like non-artificial human conversational agents that's a pretty good. If you're able to have a conversation, you're able to do a lot of other things. I also wanted to talk briefly about Sparrow, which is the model out of DeepMind that came out shortly before ChatGPT. The reason it's not gotten as much recognition is there's no model associated with it. I'm sure that will change soon, but it actually, in a sort of convergent evolution, uses a similar tactic as the reinforcement learning schedule of ChatGPT. The difference is that they don't just get the preferred responses. They also have adversarial probing, and they have a set of rules that they want to try to teach the model. So it's not just, yeah, buddy, you're doing great. It's, you're doing great. Also, you're not being sexist. Also, you don't have a body. Also, you don't exist. Like, you're not a person. Also, don't say racist stuff. We already had one Twitter bot going rampant. So by having these additional rules built in, they are able to more effectively align the model with sort of, constructive behavior. They also um, included two additional participants in the model, in the model's sort of conception of the conversation. So there's you, and then there's the model, and you're having a conversation. But there's also this guy named search query and this other guy named search result. And whenever the human asks you something, you can go ask search query to back you up. And he's going to go get his friend's search result, and he's going to bring him into the conversation. So basically, this allows the agent to do its own Google searches to double check, like, to show evidence for what it's saying. And that's pretty huge. I think anyone who's used ChatGPT for a bit realizes that sometimes it gives really detailed and accurate responses, and sometimes it gives really detailed and accurate lies. And there's a not insignificant amount of work when using ChatGPT that goes into figuring out if they're right. It definitely is much faster than trying to Google a very specific thing, because you just need to verify. You don't have to. You don't have to. Be as sort of, you don't have to interrogate it. You don't have to use someone's 14-year-old Stack Overflow post verbatim and correct for, the 15 new iterations of Python since then. But you got to make sure it's at least telling the truth. I also think that this could be used for more bespoke data sets, not just Google, and in parallel as well. This is just speculation on my part, but I'm seeing sort of companies sprouting up being like, yeah, we'll get you one of these fancy schmancy models, and it'll be tuned exactly to your data set. And all they'll have to do is slot in these additional data sets or data features, give them names that the algorithm can recognize, and you're off to the races. So comparing ChatGPT to Sparrow, it's kind of difficult because one doesn't have a paper, it only has a model, and the other is the inverse. So it's really hard to say how comparable they really are, because as much as DeepMind is, a force to be reckoned with, and I wouldn't doubt their work in general, you can still cherry pick results, even if subconsciously. Sparrow is significantly smaller than ChatGPT, which does show that scaling is great, but it's not necessarily necessary. But I'm not going to weigh into that too much. ChatGPT, while not being as advanced in the rules it follows and the things that it can provide, is actually usable, and that does count for something. So it is a difficult thing to really compare. If you're really curious about this particular question, I cannot recommend Letitia's comparison video highly enough. It's linked in the PowerPoint, which I'll be uploading to the text channel after this whole thing. I'm actually just going to check in real quick, see what people are saying. Yeah. See, that's the thing. I mean, you look at Stability AI, and it's like, well, we just have money to burn to buy up most of Amazon's computing. Yeah, like that's like 2/3 of the game right there. Will GPT-4 have less hallucinations? I would bet a large sum of money that it will have less hallucinations, because Sparrow is out. The people working on ChatGPT 4 or GPT 4. they're aware of it. They will be able to take lessons from it. They are likely even collaborating to some extent. Um, Not only that, but just by virtue of being a larger, better model, which they wouldn't release if it wasn't, there will be less hallucinations. Yeah, no, I completely agree, Loon Sun, that domain-specific knowledge bases are going to be very valuable for businesses. I will point out, though, that even now, actually, this is something that's going to come up later, but you'll see that even now, some pretty specific stuff is already sort of encoded there, and it's pretty impressive. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, especially when you're really pushing the model, it can start repeating itself and more regurgitating stuff than actually synthesizing. Well, that's sort of speaking to Candela. I think that that is a big part of why I like the Sparrow paper so much, because that was sort of the first and foremost question for that paper. While they're still delivering this model that presumably is state of the art, best in the world, and as we're seeing, the best in the world now is terrifying. So I think you're going to need to have those sort of embedded fundamental rules sort of baked into the model. And there's probably going to even be stuff where, in order to use these large models and then fine tune them, if you need to fine tune them, there'll be some restrictions on what it can learn because the fine tuning might violate earlier established rules. Oh man, I have so many thoughts on that. All of them negative. Open science, my guy. It's really frustrating to have a company call themselves Open AI and then release this thing on the world just out of nowhere, and then just be like, well, no one can have the model because that's our money. But I get to this point later. I don't think this is going to be. I don't think they can enforce that sort of closed system or closed model onto the world, because eventually someone with enough knowledge and money and data is going to figure some stuff out, and they're going to make it free out of spite. All right. Yes. No. You're right, and that's something that I mean, that has a lot of really interesting use cases, like in medicine. But there are some concerns that I'm really forward to hearing people discuss when these large models, these powerful genies, modern genies, have information specific to you as a person. I think there's some food for thought there. All right, so how does ChatGPT change things? I'm sure I'm a little bit speaking to the choir, but hopefully I can show you guys some stuff that you are unaware of, or have done some tests that you are, I don't know, impressed by. Please like me. But this is unquestionably the next ImageNet moment. For those of you who are maybe a little newer to AI, ImageNet is, I think, a an image classification competition that for years we saw very slow incremental progress, and then Jan LeCun and his team came in with a deep convolutional neural network, and in 2 years had doubled the accuracy. And within, I think, 5 or 6, it was indistinguishable from human accuracy. That was when the wider world started taking notice of AI as a field, and this is that again, but more. The Turing test is functionally dead. There are some very stringent definitions that maybe it doesn't pass yet. That's fine. I had an email exchange with someone yesterday, and I am still not sure if it was a bot or not, because it it's hard to tell. And once you get into that sort of murky gray area, it's dead. You need to find something else. The person who can find the next actually secure captcha is gonna do well for themselves. Uh, Earlier this year, we saw a paper and a model called Gato, which could do like 600 different tasks, kind of good. This is a generalist agent that can do n number of tasks pretty frickin' well. You can by being a conversational agent, essentially, you can see you can cut things up in so many different ways that it kind of becomes useless to differentiate between the different tasks because it can be used for so many different things. It can be used for editing, code generation, research, clarification. The number of things this thing can do uh, resists classification, and I think that's going to be a game changer. Even with only small and incremental improvements over the next 5 years, the fact that we're at the level we are with ChatGPT right now, and it's only going to get better, means that it's going to be a significant shift. We're seeing the very beginnings of that now with people being accused of cheating when they're not, or cheating and it being completely undetectable, among many, many other things. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of the sorts of changes that I think we're going to see over the next few years. So I am privileged enough to work for a company that when I say, hey, instead of making a search algorithm, why don't we just use this? They're like, cool. Does it cost money? It can. Neat. Here's the credit card. And I was able to buy a for mostly for professional use, but I get some free queries there as well. I was able to buy a uh, license for ChatSonic, which is GPT-3 or GPT. Oh no, it is GPT-3, but with Google Access. There are some things it's worse than ChatGPT at because it doesn't have that reinforcement learning algorithm. At least I don't believe it does. But having real-time data that it's ingested in the last 24 hours is pretty huge. So here I make a hypothetical situation of, my neighbor ran into a car. What statutes can I, or ran into my porch? What statutes can I use to sue him? And it gives a pretty compelling breakdown. Now you might be thinking, well, yes, it can say all these things and they look fine, but are they right? I don't know, but what I do know is that if you ask it for a specific article and are persistent with how you word it, I find that you often need to coach it and prompt it and encourage it to not abridge things, to give the full thing. You can get some pretty incredible data recovery here. So here I ask for a specific statute in the Quebec Civil Code, specifically Article 1457. And you're free to read this as you want. This bottom one is from the actual government site, and the one up top here is generated by ChatSonic. There is only one typo in this, and that is that in this line, you can see it says he or she. Oops. And that's not the original wording. And that is sort of the encouragement to be egalitarian encoded into the model, I believe, because it doesn't make that mistake again. It goes back to referring just to he. But this is a verbatim, other than that small misstep, verbatim recovery of that highly specific request for information. I'm just going to quickly check back here, see how you guys are going. I think looking at Loon's son's comment, I think that's true that there's going to be some pretty specific stuff, especially things that are like knowledge management focused, that are more tacit knowledge than explicit, that ChatGPT is going to really struggle with. But if it can be given that knowledge, exactly. Looking at comparison of Googling versus ChatGPT, I completely agree. Obviously, you want to make sure you're double checking, but even the results you get from ChatGPT can inform the search you give, and you can find something to confirm that it is correct, basically. Though that order of operations can be problematic, as we'll talk about in a second. Yeah, and is it possible? Well, we know for a fact that you can detect if text is generated by ChatGPT because people have made discriminators of that already. In sort of the distant past of 8 years ago, when GANs were first published and coming to prominence, that would be trained automatically. We've moved pretty far beyond that, and it's not really the method that works well for text. But I think the same principle can be used. I mean, it just as ChatGPT makes it really easy to create huge dialogue data sets, those can be used for discriminators pretty easily. But it then becomes an arms race, right? Like one is going to keep trying to evade the other or fool the other. And it's now at a point where that's an arms race that has consequences, like real consequences. So that's something we'll talk a bit more about in the discussion section. So here's a series of questions that my wife asked it because I wanted to show her this because I think it's important that she know it exists. And here you see that it gives a pretty compelling narrative about who it is and what it wants to do. It's a very good person, allegedly. And it even has like it hallucinates this event that happened where it went to go volunteer at a local animal shelter and it spent hours helping with the animals. And that's a little unsettling, and it gets worse. So you can even drill down into that and ask it about someone specific, and it makes it up flawlessly. Like there's in everyday conversation on the internet, there's no way to detect that this is a robot, an AI, without some sort of specific tool that does that. And it's actually like a compelling, sort of heartfelt story. Like you can kind of envision what this person's life might be like and sort of what they're doing. Because it even comes up with a reason why it can't adopt Daisy. It's not because it's an AI in a computer that doesn't have physical form. It's because its apartment has a no pet policy, don't you know? It can also handle my wife's very silly questions, maybe not scientifically accurately, but plausibly. And this is sort of the hallucinations we were talking about earlier, where it can not really know an answer, or maybe there's not really a concrete answer to give, and it gives no indication of that. It just confidently tells you this is what's going to happen. I actually think, and this is mostly because of Sparrow, but I think this is going to be this level of it is going to be solved pretty quickly. What we're going to have to be careful about is what about when, in order to verify something, you would have to do, a few hours of actual dedicated reading and research. Then we might start running into issues in when it starts describing larger concepts that it might get little small but important things wrong in. We might have an issue that's a little harder to tackle. Finally, I kind of want to see what happens when you push this thing to its limit. So I asked it about a specific boss in a specific video game, which I was playing at the time, so I had enough knowledge from my own searching and playing to determine how right it was. So here we can see that the stuff in gray is just stuff that is either true universally within the game or is a repetition. But we see a fair bit of this is sort of at the level of what you'd get from Googling and reading through the wiki a little bit. It does get one thing wrong. This particular boss is not very robust. It's actually pretty fragile. But it does give one piece of information that you focus. This is a tandem boss. There's like a beast and its tamer. The correct way to do it is you target the beast first because it's far more threatening and doesn't have any more health. And once you defeat it, the tamer gives up and you win. And it says that. I know the Wikipedia page or the wiki page that it got this from. And so it is still regurgitating, but that was something that it took me a little while to actually dig in and find. And I asked this question before I found it. So technically, this prompt, or this response rather, helped me beat that boss, which is pretty neat. Finally, I decided to push this thing to the absolute limit and talk about a thing that maybe 10 people in the country care about, my thesis. And what I'm doing is research into using topological data analysis for molecular generation or materials generation at quote bulk scales. It's hard to say large scales when you're talking in like micrometers, but bulk scales is typically the term. And here we can see it repeats itself a fair bit. It just says, by understanding the structure of the data, the model can better predict materials properties. I wasn't asking about materials properties. Materials generation is a related but separate problem. There's a fair bit of this that was, I would call, like boilerplate or easily Googleable stuff about topological data analysis and how it can be used. This is all true, but it's not insightful. But the fact that TDA gives you the shape of the data, and more importantly, the fact that TDA can be used to identify potential interactions between molecules or materials and capture long-range interactions, that was something that I did several days of dedicated reading and research, note-taking, all that grad school shit, to come to the conclusion about. And that is sort of the thrust of my thesis. And while I did, tell it that I was looking for large molecules and bulk materials, I never said the phrase long-range interactions, and that was what I was looking for. So even when you're pushing this thing to the limit, it can still surprise you with sort of the insightfulness that it has. I'm going to go back here and see what's up again. Oh yeah, man, I read about the AI Dungeon Master thing a few years ago. I'm like, that's not going to really work. There's too many limitations. Now it's just like, no, that's a viable business strategy. That's a thing that can happen. We're maybe not quite there for fully unsupervised DMing, but we're getting close. Hopefully, Wizards of the Coast doesn't decide to claim that too. Look, I played through Team of Horrors. That's why would you do that to anyone? All right. So what is next? It may be that models keep getting bigger, and we actually start running out of valuable new data to give it. At a certain point, when you're consuming sizable percentages of the meaningful text that humans have produced, there's probably going to be some diminishing returns. Maybe new innovations in the architecture will improve sample efficiency, and models will actually be able to get smaller while maintaining and improving present capabilities. Maybe the fact that researchers can now tear through probably twice as many papers with the help of ChatGPT explaining anything they don't understand or they need clarification on, maybe that starts accelerating scientific progress in general and it becomes a virtuous cycle. But anyone who's telling you what the future is and that they know what it is selling you something. No one knows. We can just make our best guesses. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a bit of time to look at some of the very short-term predictions of things that almost certainly are going to happen in the near future. So there are some features that we know are going to be integrated and are going to be available because we've seen that it's possible. So the intrinsic evidence inclusion and the addition of more and more robust rules from Sparrow is unquestionably going to come to a public model soon, probably from DeepMind, and then shortly after everyone else. There's going to be improved real-time reasoning. ChatGPT can't do that right now, but ChatSonic is able to. And while it has other deficiencies compared to ChatGPT, that's more of like a business issue than an actual model limitation. Finally, as Mr. Wolfram himself suggested, I think it's just sort of a no-brainer to add in the ability to use Wolfram Alpha into these models to make their mathematical reasoning more robust. We also know that GPT-4 is going to be coming soon, within the next 3 to 6 months. If it wasn't released by next September, I'd be very surprised. Very surprised. They don't want to let the hype die down. They don't want anyone to stop talking about this before they release their big thing. So, I'm sure we're going to see claims about GPT-4 that are vastly overstated from both people in OpenAI and outside. But we're also probably going to see significant and noticeable improvements over ChatGPT because everyone's paying attention to them. The last thing they're going to do is release a model that is disappointing. Even though OpenAI isn't really true to its name anymore, I think that there's enough competition and enough people who kind of want to get their cut that people are the resources and tools and the necessary compute to make competitors is going to filter into the public domain over time, which should hopefully mean that you're not going to have to pay $200 a month to use ChatGPT or something ridiculous. There should be competition, and it will hopefully be more accessible. We're also probably going to see more companies, though maybe even universities, doing a model first release because they've seen how well it went for ChatGPT. Obviously, ChatGPT is exceptional in its own right, but we're going to see copycats unquestionably. All right. I'm actually just going to leave this here for you guys to read for a second, and I'm going to use my phone to check the Discord without taking that from you. But this is just some speculative fiction of what large language models might be able to do in the next 5 years. Hey, Karim. Is Wikipedia really a reliable source of data sets? Honestly, yes. Like, I know, I actually talked to Pablo about this earlier today. I know, like, your fifth grade librarian probably told you to never use Wikipedia. It is actually pretty well cited, but it's a lot like ChatGPT itself, where you need to take everything with a grain of salt. You got to follow those citations sometimes. You got to find other sources. Should we be worried about data poisoning? Absolutely, but probably not yet. How much supervised dialogue labeling and ranking went into ChatGPT? No, no. Unfortunately, we don't. Which is one of the reasons why not releasing a paper is kind of a bit of a slap in the face to the scientific community, to the research community, because we really don't know anything except this broad scheme that they added to GPT-3, which itself was just a scale up of previous models. Yeah, Semantic Scholar is great. I also I'm not gonna sort of show it here because I haven't had enough chance to really use it. But there are some other really interesting scientific assistants, like research assistants, that have come out that let you like highlight things in PDFs and explain them or ask questions about them. Even worse than ChatGPT in the sense that it is not a research institution. They are a company through and through. Oh, Candela, I also predict a ton of AI startup scams or just business. I mean, we're going to have people able to erect entire ecosystems and histories and websites and what have you, and just be like, oh yeah, I've been here the whole time. Have you never heard of me? Why don't you take my card? And it's going to be an interesting age in terms of scams and how to protect yourself from them. Um, so I'm gonna. Oh, is the presentation on? Oh, I don't know. Hi, are you guys able to hear me now? Hello? I don't know. I don't know what's happening. This, like I said, it's all a work in progress. I'm gonna stick with finishing up the presentation, and we're gonna all have a big conversation. We'll hopefully be able to answer most of the questions people have posted here. All right, share screen. Let's do this thing. All right. All right. So, speculative fiction. I hope you guys had a chance to read that before everything went to shit. Rug pull. That was entirely written by ChatGPT. Um, this is the main part of it. That slide is the main part that was written only by ChatGPT. But I use it in several other places as well. So the explain it like I'm five, I got it to write that. Though I did sort of cut parts of it and just put it in quotes, so it's just one cohesive thing that I could leave there. It wrote the bibliography because I hate messing with citations, but it did need some constructive criticism on some of them. It also wrote the regular expression example, which I think was kind of apparent given the background, but I also hate working with regular expressions, so win-win for me. Um, I knew the quote existed, but I didn't have very much context for it. So in order to get the quote about AI being able to do anything a man can do in 20 years back in the 60s, I had to give it the prompt examples of quotes of AI optimism from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it gave me exactly what I was looking for. I could not Google it very effectively though. The TF-IDF vectors were based on code from Stack Overflow because I literally just needed something that would demonstrate my point. But it went by key rather than value, and so I got ChatGPT to alter the code to go by value. And while it did need a little bit of tweaking because it got some of the variable names wrong, it worked pretty much out of the box. Finally, the main thing that I used ChatGPT for was to structure this presentation. I knew that it was going to be a history. I knew that I needed to try to pick the most important little bits. And so I had it give me a list of the 20 most important achievements in NLP, starting with Alan Turing and ending with GPT-3. I also encouraged it to give references to further reading, which is what I eventually turned the bibliography into, or got the bibliography from. So this is the actual thing. And this is the complete response for that first query. And what we're seeing here is that after 8, it just sort of gives up, it gets bored. But until then, it's pretty good. It seems to know pretty early on it's only going to have 8 entries because it jumps from like the 60s, 70s, and 80s all only get there, and 90s all only get there like one entry each, and then we're into the 2000s, which fair. A lot of the biggest breaks have come from that. But if we prompt it for some more, so I asked for 6 more, we start getting other things from the recent past. And I had to prompt it a few other times to make sure that it got everything. We're seeing that there are still limits on the length of text that can be generated, but that that limitation is quickly shrinking to the point where I'm not actually sure if this is ChatGPT's limitation or the API's limitation, and they just don't want to give you, whole chapters of books for free. What skills do you really need to use ChatGPT? Because there are ways to use it less or more effectively. The biggest thing is being able to break up what you want into smaller pieces, which is a pretty common thing for anyone who codes. But it's even more important in some ways for ChatGPT right now because the smaller the output you request from it, with the more detail for the prompt, the better response you're typically going to get. So if you give it a highly specific web scraping problem, essentially, and just say, I want to get the requests from this, and I want them formatted like X, Y, and Z, and make sure you are grabbing, T, W, and J, then you're going to get something very good. And then you can take that code and you can put it back in the input and say, why don't or can you please multi-thread this for me? And it'll do that. But you got to break it up into those smaller components to really get the most out of it. Skepticism is also really important because you can essentially get yourself lied to at your own prompting, if you're not careful. It's important to always have some idea of what a right answer would look like when you're using this thing, and it's very important to not be, running or citing anything that you don't have an original source for. Running, that's more applicable for people who don't actually know how to code, generating things that run code. But if you're using this to inform research, you really just got to make sure that you're getting some lead for a definitive source along with your answers. And the last thing is integrity. As we've sort of discussed already in the chat, there are ways of detecting that this has been used. And while that will not always be the case, I think that it's going to become something more akin to like ad blocker than like a dedicated model as we go forward. There's going to be a constant arms race, but in general, the good quote good actors outcompete the bad by sheer numbers, and so your computer isn't constantly bombarded with viruses because Windows antivirus or just Linux being Linux are pretty resistant to that sort of thing. And in the same way, you might be able to get away with it, you might not, but it's really better for everyone if you don't try and just be sort of upfront if you can be. All right, tips and tricks. This is really less of a presentation thing and more something you guys can reference later, but you can really ask this thing to like correct itself and get better results. And I found that requesting citations and sources in particular is very useful. It still can't really reason in any meaningful way. And a lot of the synthesis is more picking up on patterns and just saying, yep, this is a pattern, and it's probably important, rather than coming up with something novel on its own. Like even the long-range dependency example, that would have been stated at in various points in the papers that it's ingested. It's just impressive it was able to dig out something that small from such a vast ocean. And of course, when you really push it, when you really ask a lot of it, it's going to sort of, in some ways, it reverts back to previous generation chatbots. Yes, the information it gives are much more impressive, but it's going to start repeating itself and regurgitating things, and it's going to become more apparent that it's a bot. All right, so now we are at the actual discussion and interaction portion of this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it's a real pain in the butt. And I'm going to open the floor for people to start joining the call, and we can start having a discussion about this, the impacts, and the papers themselves, of course. In the meantime, while people sort of decide what they want to ask, I will try to answer some questions as best as I can. So, scholarly articles. I have used ChatGPT for a while for, messing around with the research I'm doing. I've actually found that it's pretty comprehensive in the scholarly articles it's ingested, and then all the other non-scholarly work just sort of makes it a more competent chatbot. So I think this outclasses anything Facebook has released so far by a significant margin. Where do I think this is going? I sincerely hold to a generally anti-futurist outlook in that I don't think that I don't want to state anything as where I think things are going to go. A possibility, I think, is that we enter a new age of information wars, basically. We have bubbles where each person has their own, not each person, but the people who watch Fox News listen to the Fox News chatbot, and the Fox News chatbot, this is some weird thing about black people, but then you have the CNN chatbot, and they're that they don't have that bias, but maybe they have some other questionable views about other things. And that's not really to take a shot at those specific. Okay, that's always a shot at Fox News, but it's more to point out that we're going to be able to insulate ourselves from particular information really effectively, not just in like when we start offloading the entirety of like news navigation to AI, which we can do now, or we'll be able to do shortly. There's going to be some problems that have started that get a lot worse, a lot faster. All right. Is there who? Let's get some other speakers. If anyone else has comments that they want to voice, please make a request to speak, and we'll I'll stop being alone here. I'm not on Twitter.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really insightful and interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'm really interested about. So I have like my weekends, I have my evenings, and I'm really
Mhm.
looking into where should I put my focus on. Like, what should I study?
I feel
What
you.
area should I be focused on? What kind of things should I be like? Even things to read. Like there are so many like newsletter out there. Like it, it's very difficult to like find what you should focus on these days in that area.
I completely agree. It's sort of I don't know your background. I'm happy to talk to you like after the presentation and just converse in general in the forum or in the Discord. But I honestly think that the best use of this sort of technology is instead of asking what's the best thing for me to focus on, what's the thing I would
Yeah,
most enjoy working on? What's the thing that would be most productive? I mean, I don't know everyone's financial situation. I, for one, have a lot of student debt, so I'd love to just play D&D with my friends all day, but I do need to provide for my family. So it's sort of split between things that I think are really interesting and fun and things that can make me money. So you want ChatGPT and this sort of similar class of bots can allow you to find the best sort of overlap of those things or whatever your weighting of those different things is, and let you learn and engage with them at a very rapid pace. I feel so like rather than having to go and watch a bunch of YouTube videos and read a bunch of books and uh, you know uh, try a bunch of code yourself, you can do all that stuff, but you can get a jump start on it by getting like a summary of the book, by getting examples of the code, by getting explanations of the papers you read. That would be
yeah,
my best case scenario for
yeah.
how to use it.
And so I might have missed it in the beginning because I joined a bit late. So how are you involved like in this in this world? Like how are you taking
Yeah,
part of this
yeah.
generative AI?
Well, I will be posting my the presentation for everyone to use and see and do with what they will,
Yeah.
which does have my quote credentials. I got into AI about 6 years ago. I just really liked computer science, even though I was introduced to it after my bachelor's finished. Um, and NLP and Word2Vec specifically, actually, were the algorithms that sort of grabbed my attention because my undergrad was in psychology and I focused
Mm,
on bias and uh, confirmation bias specifically is what I looked at, and I saw NLP as a way to potentially rectify it. And with ChatGPT, I'm find myself pulled back into the space because I sort of left it for a while to work on other generative models. Because yeah, now all these things where we were seeing with social media are going to potentially get worse as we go forward with ChatGPT
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
similar things. So that's sort of my background and perspective on it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, man. Thank you very much.
Winsome?
Yes, hello. How's it going?
Hey, good.
Good, good. Yeah, so I actually have. It's funny. Yeah, you and I actually have some like, similar backgrounds. Did you get your BA at McGill as well?
No, I got my BA at Bishop's.
Oh, okay. I did my psych BA at McGill.
Nice.
Yeah, but like we, I know like the conversation generally around NLP right now is completely dominated by large language models,
Hmm.
but like at my work and within the field in general of I'm a industrial organization psychologist is what I
Oh,
went into.
nice.
Like, yeah, these things are very useful. They could be helpful, but like to me, just something simple like doing topic modeling on survey respondents from or doing something like creating canonized domain-specific knowledge bases
Mm.
of like in order to like that kind of NLP is the stuff that I'm more interested in. Is the more the business use case that we have. So it's like there's so much advancement in this, but like I wonder how much this is overshadowing like the more smaller scale but still incredibly useful uses of NLP.
So I'll say, I mean, maybe I should have started the conversation with this, but I have long been a skeptic and a detractor of these papers that are like, and then we added more parameters and it was better. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
And I still think that that's a pretty boring direction for research in general.
Mm-hmm.
But the last few months have shown me that, like, yes, that's true. This is not all the research that will ever be useful. But like this has clear utility right now. So in the example you gave, there's not so much you can do for the like any sort of like bespoke like classified or not classified, but you know, like protected information that you need to manipulate. That is some stuff that you need to keep to yourself essentially for privacy and security reasons. But like you mentioned topic modeling, you could do topic modeling or now you know the guy you just hired fresh out of business school who's never coded in his life could do the topic modeling. You just need to explain to him what topic modeling is and say here's a book and a chatbot, it will let you do it. And like obviously that's an insanely irresponsible thing to do for so many reasons, but
Yeah.
it's possible. And so for someone like yourself who actually like knows what they're doing and could do these things themselves, I mean, all the examples I gave of how I use ChatGPT in the presentation, it's not that those weren't things that I could do. Of course I could. It's things I didn't want to do or things that I could do faster with ChatGPT. So you could get it to write some boilerplate code for you in Python to get all your code nice and neat and ready for topic modeling. It's not going to be running the code. It's not going to be, you know, analyzing it, but it can give you the little snippets and bits and bobs that, you know, before would take you to Stack Overflow, then Google, then probably some obscure documentation, then Pandas, and then you'd get it and it would work and it'd be fine. But then, you know, an hour and a half has gone by. Now it can be like, hey, go do this thing. And then 6 seconds later, you have something that, oh, perfect. You're going to need to make some tweaks, but it's nothing like catastrophic.
I do though wonder in that case for those things like a person trying to learn a new topic and trying to then apply it, how much the process of researching on their own using just a search engine and reading things like is part of the cementing of knowledge where you may not actually get that if the ChatGPT does the cementing of knowledge for you. Like
I completely
yeah,
agree.
so just as an example, like you know the thing you showed where it's like you know the bot like cemented that information about your thesis for you, but the cementing of knowledge about your thesis was a fundamental part of you yourself gaining a
Yes.
better understanding of the field.
Exactly. Like that. The reason why I went through great lengths to explain why that was impressive was because rightfully none of you had any context. I had to go to some pretty specific rabbit holes to find that. So you're absolutely right. I actually have two individuals. One is a friend of mine who is an accountant, and one is the son of a friend of mine who's just he likes sports and he likes web scraping. So that's what we talk about. And I have told neither of them to use ChatGPT in any of their studies because I absolutely feel that it would be detrimental. You need to have enough knowledge to know not just what you don't know, but know what you should be doing yourself, right? Like I mean, you could be making models, and they're coming. Trust me, where your basic regular code is going to take as input output from a model. You don't know what that's a terrible idea. You don't know what that model is going to give. We were talking about data poisoning earlier. Easiest exploit in the world to pull off if you can get it to give some weird inputs. It's like next generation SQL injection. So you need to have the knowledge to know how and when to use it. You can't just it's not a panacea. You're absolutely right.
I also find in general, just like you know, like you and I both coming from like more like behavioral science backgrounds,
Yeah.
like it's incredibly easy for people to come to conclusions, even in rigorous scientific research,
Yep.
that are terrible because they don't understand the underlying statistical, mathematical, or just computational mechanisms that create the answers that they have.
Yeah.
Things like
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the fact that something like p-value is like the most important
Yeah.
way of determining statistical significance in most psychology papers, even though it is an incredibly old and very, very rudimentary metric, just tells you that like how much it's very easy to just fool yourself into thinking that you know what's going on.
The day that I go to Christmas and my aunt tells me, well, I know the vaccines are dangerous because, the robots told me, I'm going to walk into a forest and scream until I die. That's how my
Just go
life
move to
ends.
Lac Saint Jean and just like sit
Yeah,
and watch
no,
berry fields.
exactly. Because like it's absolutely going to be something where people who don't really actually understand what they're asking are going to start querying this thing as if it is an all-knowing genie and will take its results as gospel. And that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier with this sort of like spheres of bias depending on what chat model you use. I mean, that might not be the form of it, but it's the next step in this sort of information superhighway that the internet started. And I worry in a society where we still haven't really gotten information literacy down from the last big jump, what happens when the next big jump comes? Like it's here, it's coming. So like there need to be some changes, and there needs to be some. I mean, re-education is a scary word, but people need to, of all ages, need to learn how to more critically examine information.
They need to be upskilled, basically.
Yeah, essentially.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic.
All good.
Great presentation.
Oh, thank you. I think Candela, I believe.
It's me. So, Tyler,
Yeah.
this about teaching people the realities of AI. Do we really have the skill to do this? Because every time we try to teach the populace about something new, they always lag behind, which is very worrying.
I mean,
AI
yeah.
is on the rise everywhere, and I'm glad about my studying about AI to avoid these fear mongering stuff.
I mean, in some ways, I left psychology and then went into um, to computer science, got all the skills needed, and I'm like, okay, guys, but the humanities are important because you're absolutely right. Like my mother is a retired teacher, my sister is a teacher. Like this, even when it's not in, or sorry, even in an explicit classroom setting, this is something that's going to be hard to teach. I mean, we're seeing the waves of like ChatGPT generated essays and stuff, and they're still like sort of holding on to this idea of this being the skill that needs to be taught. When I feel that there needs to be a shift towards information literacy and discrimination more than generation at this point. And then, like you said, how do you reach the people who aren't in school anymore? How do you reach the types of, let's call them, less curious people who don't innately want to find out how these things work, and that's what makes them dangerous in the sense that they can become very loudly and aggressively misinformed about stuff. But I can't pretend to have any sort of answer. I'm really not sure how you upskill a population for this type of shift when we failed to do it the last time when we had 2
That's
decades.
why I always ask, are these AI ethics, which AI ethics do you consider not enforceable for now?
That's a whole can of worms. But like, so the two main branches I see are like the AI ethics of like how do we prevent Skynet, and the AI ethics of how do we live in a world with AI where AI is everywhere. And I think that latter one is more important right now. But I myself am still sort of adjusting to this new reality. I still don't have any good answers or even suggestions for like how we go about this, because it's going to be a problem and society isn't prepared for it. So
Oh boy.
I do want to get to some of the questions in the chat. Chrome asked, do I have an opinion on Chat GPT connecting to AGI? before, if you asked me 3 months ago, a large language model is going to lead to AGI, I would have been like, no, that's stupid. There's this thing called causality, and we don't understand it. We don't know how to encode it. It's vital for any sort of AGI. Now I'm sort of
Also,
reevaluating. Sorry, just a second. I'm reevaluating what AGI actually means, because I'm reevaluating what AGI would be dangerous, and I don't think we're there yet. I don't think it's going to be something we have to worry about in like the next 5 years. But as soon as you start seeing with any regularity AI models integrated into production, where the AI models are regularly queried to start writing code themselves and then have it run, that's where we start looking at models that begin resembling uh, life forms in the Darwinian sense. And I can't really say, but it's something I'm keeping my eye on, Chrome. Yeah, Loonson, I agree. Like I've found that obviously the technical skills are very important for getting in the door, but once you're through the door, that psych background, and honestly even just like a fundamental appreciation of like social sciences and the context that we are creating these things in is the most useful thing day to day. Sorry, Kandala, you were saying something? It becomes the issue of like it can access. It only takes one dumbass to release a model that is able to alter its own code to create a virus that, unlike traditional malware, where no one's worried about Stuxnet anymore, no one's worried about the "I love you" bug, but if you release a model that can adapt in some way, then you have something that might be closer to a flu in eradicating. Yeah, I think NLP discussion or AI ethics would be good. This chat itself, I'm happy to keep using as well. Um, but then also feel free to, yeah, like when you start these conversations, feel free to directly ping me or others who are interested in it, so that we can have this conversation in sort of an asynchronous way, and we don't have to feel constrained to time zones or causality. Yeah, Loonsun's got it. Yeah, I would probably, it'll probably find me on NLP discussions, but I'll try to be around for a while after this regardless, because it's a very interesting topic that I didn't even scratch the surface of. I mean, I I had a bit of a manic productivity episode last night while finishing the presentation, and I came up with a solid page of the various ways that this technology is going to be used in malicious capacities. Like, I mean, just imagine how devastating spear phishing attacks are going to get. And for anyone who doesn't know, a spear phishing attack is when you impersonate someone that the target knows in order to gain access to their credentials or other sensitive information. So, like, if you have a model as capable as ChatGPT and you feed it, the entire history of your conversation with your aunt and all of her terrible Facebook posts, and then you go and email your cousin, you could perfectly identify or impersonate their mother and steal their house or something. Obviously, it's a bit silly, but
false
these
flag
things,
operations multiplied to oblivion.
yeah, it's going to get it's a little wild. Yeah, right. Like it's either just playing games or manic compensating for procrastination. Does anyone else want to speak up, like in the literal sense? Request to join. Yeah, I'm
Very
both
good.
on the
Thank you for
spectrum
the
and
presentation.
sorry.
I was going to say, thanks for the presentation, Tyler. I am leaving the chat now. Goodbye.
All good. Thank you for joining.
No problem.
And you guys, no one should feel compelled to stay here. I'll be here until we're done. Everyone's done talking. But I love this stuff, so I'm happy to keep talking until someone stops me. Self-supervised adaptation with models, which would allow them to rewrite. Not yet, not in any meaningful way, and I don't think that we're even going to see that for a while. But it's something that, with where the models are right now, able to write the snippets of code they can, I no longer see like a fundamental barrier to them being able to write longer things. And then it's just a matter of making them aware of what their own code does. And I'm a little that idea scares me a bit because it really then becomes a thing that can adapt. Uh, Yeah, it could, but then consider, well, why don't we make, why don't we make a dozen of these things? And the ones that don't kill themselves are maybe they're better. And then you have something that is quite literally Darwinian evolution. Oh, thanks. See you later, Pablo. Yeah. Oh, one thing we should have done is if anyone has a topic they would like to present themselves, we are hoping to get community members involved. It isn't going to just be Alex and I doing these, hopefully. But, I mean, clearly I have a lot of things to say just in general, and you're a captive audience. So if you make me, I will. But we would prefer some variety. That's true, and that is something to consider. But that's what I was saying, Karim, about how yes, we've definitely seen models getting bigger and bigger, but the ones that aren't just scale because you can, and like Sparrow, that are actually like showing some clever changes to their training scheme, I think we're going to be surprised and potentially a little caught unawares when gigabit internet is slow and the average hard drive can hold it's counted in terabytes, and then these models become a little more manageable. Yeah. Anyone who wants to present later on, feel free to DM me or just ping us in the chat to discuss. But I think I'm going to just sort of more or less officially call this an end. I will hang around to answer any questions people have, but my voice is skipping out. So thank you all for attending and for putting up with my special interest presentation, which is basically what this was.